Everybody, apologize for not being on the live stream that got shared. If you're 1 minute late, totally kicks you off. So for the future, we will do our best to be on time. But I wanted to walk around since it's nice outside and start the discussion here. So what we wanted to talk about was the city council vote from last night, or what happened, and get people's questions, thoughts. It's been an interesting week, as we had a lot of people calling in. Number one comments section was about police use of force and how the police responded to the Black Lives Matter protests that were going on for almost basically 2 weeks now. That, for the record, has been moved to Friday at 11:30. There's a special council meeting specifically to discuss officers' use of force, etc. So if you didn't get your comments in, I know they cut people off early. Oh, check that out so that your voice can be heard. From what we heard, that was a touchy subject. Mayor, police chief discussed why they, attempted to justify what use of force they provided and talk about what they may or may not do in the future to improve the relationship of our officers with crowds protesting. I know some people have kind of seen the news today where San Jose is looking to ban rubber bullets for crowd control, things like that we probably seriously need to sit down and have long, hard conversations, both locally in a governmental sense and then in our community. What does that mean for people? And that's why we're talking about it today. It's a touchy subject. I mean, people go back and forth on this. It gets heated. But if our elected officials stay away from heated discussions, we don't really make progress. So again, jump on, share this feed with people in the community so that we can actually have a discussion. Not everybody can make council meetings and sit there for hours and hours. That was something else that came up as well. What is our process for making sure that the entire community is heard? If you're waiting for item 6.2 and we're on 3.4, you may not have the time to sit around for another 2 hours and check out what's going on to wait for your opportunity to comment. Traditionally, we throw a big agenda at City Council on a Tuesday afternoon, 11 these days, but it's always been about 1:30, and not many of us can make that. Working class people have a really hard time getting to all of these very specific instances where you have to make public comment. There's opportunity to send in emails, to call ahead of time, but if it's a discussion, if you want to hear how your council person, how your representative responds to the things that you're saying, what kind of feedback the rest of the community is also giving, then we want spaces for dialogue. We want them to happen before the vote happens, and not just the 30 minutes before the vote happens, but on multiple occasions. We could be looking at totally innovating the way that City of San Jose does its community engagement for our council meetings. Do we compartmentalize it? Make sure that we're talking about housing on Tuesday and crime on Wednesday and social services or traffic on Thursday. We got to get ourselves out of this box because there are a lot of people that don't have their voice heard. That's an interesting discussion. Again, add comments, but also send me emails, send me thoughts. This is an opportunity for me to learn as well and get out ahead of what the traditional mindset is for a representative. We want to break out of the box and give more opportunity to our community. Other things that were touched on, we talked a little bit more about the digital divide. I know we did almost 30 minutes on the digital divide here in District 6 in the city of San Jose, but there's more to that than just who has access in terms of an educational perspective. What does the digital divide do for people that are searching for employment? What does the digital divide do for seniors, for people that need access to resources? That is also a very impactful perspective that we have to take when addressing this type of policy. At this point, in my opinion, access to the internet, it's a utility. Just like water, just like power, you're not going to be able to work within today's structures in a timely manner and be an effective resident, an effective employee, a husband, wife, spouse, parent, without that kind of resource. It's just so vital now. And we can't have 15% of our city without that access. One of the other items that got brought up from both an educational perspective and a environmental perspective was this Charcot extension. It's a piece of roadway going by Orchard School over in District 4, and there was a lot of heated comment on that as well, because we do know that the closer we put our schools, any community for that matter, to a road, there are detrimental impacts to respiratory health. Then there are the external, impacts to the overall environment. There's the continuation of old policies on expanding roads, expanding access for cars that in COVID we are absolutely seeing may not be necessary. It may, not only should we have been taking a look at all of those things from a climate perspective, but from this COVID, work from home, housing crisis perspective, I think you'd have a really hard time making a good argument for why we need to continue expanding roadways and putting the health of our children at risk, especially. Significant increases in asthma, in other respiratory illnesses when schools, elementary schools, middle schools are placed by big roadways like this. So, again, there was a couple of important things, just like there always are, and we want to make sure everybody's engaged. So, Jessica, what are your thoughts on regards to the police brutality of protesters? What do you think should be done about it? I've been down there quite a few days, 7 or 8 days over the last 2 weeks. Myself, we had a rubber bullet go between my girlfriend and I at about 4:30 on, I believe it was Sunday of last week. And that was as we were listening to speakers talk about the need for social and racial justice in our community and across the country. When it came roundabout to that discussion, why did that happen? Because we were about 55 yards away. People had said, a water bottle was thrown and the guy decided to shoot into the crowd. Who knows who that could have hit and what that does to then reduce the effectiveness of officers to calm a crowd down. Everyone gets heated if you're going to be shot in the side of the head and you were sitting there listening to someone talk about a very emotional, important, needed discussion in our community these days. There are aspects that we absolutely have to reevaluate. Do I think rubber bullets are effective use of crowd control? Absolutely not. Do I think tear gas is an effective use for crowd control? Absolutely not. I think we would be hard pressed to find people that do think that is how you're going to react to people expressing their, right to free assembly. That's a huge challenge for us in the coming future, and that's why went through a whole bunch of notes to talk about what is important that's coming out of this needed discussion. We are at a spot where our city is facing an environmental crisis, whatever you would call a pandemic, a healthcare crisis, affordable housing crisis, crisis for our unhoused community, and all of those things require significant investment from us. And yet we do have, when you take a look at what our general fund budget is about 44%. Over $400 million a year are spent on policing. And so what my team did, went through and just took a look at what is that cost? Like, where is it coming from? So I'm going to look down at my computer here because that's where I got my notes. But I think there's, a lot of value in just talking about what that gets us. What does that $400 million do for our community? Noting that 24% of our budget, so again, 44% of our budget is for police, 24 is for fire, Parks and Rec accounts for 8, libraries for 4. Everybody says a budget is a moral document. It's what do you want to see, what's a priority for you to invest in and what's not a priority for you to invest in. So that's where our priorities lie right now. What is that breakdown then? Because this is really important to just start the discussion, because we all have to be working with the same basic information, because we're going to hear, lots of residents say it's time we, really take a strong look at what our officers are doing and can they be more effective? And then we're going to have other people that say we need more officers, we need to increase spending to keep our community safe. Crime has been on the rise per capita in the last couple of years here. I guess I could start with that, just to give us all the same perspective on where we're coming from. Violent crime 2010 was about 314 crimes per 100,000 residents. So we've got about 1 million people. So District 6 being 100,000 residents, 314 violent crimes in that year of 2010. If we go to the years 2013 to 2015, number goes up a little bit. It's about 325. 2017, we jumped to about 400. And 2019, we had 437 violent crimes per capita, 100,000 people. Whereas property crime has kind of gone down slightly. Same dates, 2010, 2,158 property crimes per 100,000 people. Between 2013 2015, there was about 2,450. So it went on up a little bit from there. And then 2017 and 2019, we're sitting around 2,420. So it went back down slightly from the 2013-2015 timeframe. So that's really what we're working with here as a breakdown of where we're at. And so when we talk about what do police do for our community, they do a lot of things. It's not just, stopping violent criminals. We have about $2 million of that $400+ million for crime prevention. But then we go, next line item, this is on our police budget. Next item is truancy abatement, right? Truancy abatement, a liaison to our school, $2.2 million. So the same amount we're spending on crime prevention, we're spending on truancy abatement for students, missing class. Checking on families that, may not be sending their kid to class. All of those things, get wrapped up in there. Then we spend $3 million on school safety. So we have officers around campuses, in campuses, that spend time dealing with students. We take a look then and we go into investigations, a significant increase there. Investigations are about $80 million. So significantly different, factor of 10 from, school crime prevention. Police officers do regulation enforcement, gaming permits, cannabis permits, restaurant, food, those sort of things. About $4.7 million. So again, a small piece of this, but is that a space where you have an officer with a weapon? That's the type of discussion we want to bring about, because that's going to affect how the community reacts to you, what's going on. We jump into 911 calls. 911 calls and dispatch, about $26 million. Field patrol is by far the largest, about $224 million, so about half of that $400 million budget for our police force goes into just field patrol. We have special operations. I'm going to be honest, I don't know what that is. At about $11 million, traffic enforcement at about 12. Violent crime enforcement, $4.2 million. Then we have $50 million, $51 million for management, and about $8 million for workers' comp. And that's kind of the breakdown of where we're all at. And relative to other Bay Area cities, we're sitting about halfway in how much we spend per capita on our police force. Oakland, so we're about 330 is the metric for per capita spending on officers. Oakland 675, SF 607, and then kind of on the other spectrum, Sunnyvale in the area spends about $248 dollars on police per capita. And most cities, when we take a look, we're in that 300 range. So Oakland, San Francisco are very, high and above what type of police spending they have. And so we're somewhere in the middle. Again, this is to give us a perspective. Where are we at? Because if we don't start with that discussion in our community, I think we have a hard time finding common ground with each other. I think we have a hard time pinpointing what really can be addressed and what can be fixed. From where we've been at in a campaign through this whole election cycle, crime and inequality inextricably linked. As inequality goes up, so does crime. People often say, poverty is the parent of crime. When income levels go down, the community is struggling, people find other ways to get by. And I think that's where a lot of the discussion is coming from on the side of folks that want to see some reform, some, to be honest, shifting of priorities from this budget message to other directions in our city, right? That brings me into a really important point. I don't have specific numbers for city of San Jose, but across the state of California, when we look at recidivism, when someone is arrested for a crime and then commits a crime and goes back to jail, that number drops 40%. And so people are 40% less likely to commit another crime after being released from jail if they have an education. So if we're looking at how do we address the root causes of crime, how do we address the root causes of the inequality that we see in our community in order to make us safer, in order to make our officers safer. If they don't have violent crimes to report to, their job gets pretty easy. There's still going to be lots of challenges, but to protect our community as a whole, we want the community to be safer. And if investing in education, investing in good paying jobs, investing in social services is going to mean that crime doesn't happen, I feel like that's a win from my perspective. So again, I'm interested in hearing what other people have to say about it. Because there's been a lot of comments specifically online about what's going on. And there's a lot of buzzwords going around that I don't necessarily think do the community a lot of good without us taking a deeper look. So again, that's what we're coming to here. So when people are talking about how we design a community for us, how we design a community to reduce crime without the need for use of officers, what are the root causes here? That's one perspective of this push at the city's budget, right? Let's start to invest in our community, and we won't have the need for such reactionary large police budget, right? To me, that makes sense. And then on the other side, what do our officers, what functions do they perform? We talked about the budget, we went through those functions, but specifically, when the community thinks about police, they're responding to a 911 call. They are doing their best to get to where they go, get to where they're needed, and create safety in that space. That's, I think, the ideal perspective that a lot of the community might have. And so what are those dispatches for? We get calls for, assault. But there's also calls for crime analysis. There's calls for court liaisons. There's called for family violence. There's calls for, missing persons, juvenile or otherwise, robbery, sexual assault. There's lots of things on here, and it's good to take a look at our police department budget and say, what is it that they're responding to? And then are there better ways to respond to those things? About 20% of a police officer's time could be dealing with someone with a mental illness. Are our officers the most well-trained, the most equipped to address someone with a mental illness in a safe manner, get them the assistance they need, and then move on? Or might that be, a social worker? Is that a mental health professional? If we're talking about truancy and kids skipping class, do you send an officer into a home where a child might be, or a young adult is struggling with whether or not they see value in the education system? Or do you send in someone that's more equipped to handle that type of call? And I think we miss that from a community perspective when we're talking about police, because it just can be so narrow-minded in what we think officers deal with and who they deal with and how they deal with them. But from a fiscally responsible and socially responsible perspective, is taking a look at a budget and saying, does an officer that holds a weapon and is trained in use of force to disarm someone, to incapacitate them, that to me has one role. But on the other perspective, if they're for suicide prevention, you need a mental health professional. You need someone trained to do that sort of thing. It's how we saw, it's how we thought that our community would work. But we got to take a look and say, hey, is that how it's working? Because I assumed that when someone calls 911 for someone committing suicide or attempting to commit suicide, that a mental health professional responds. And that's not the case, right? I assumed that if there, was a safe family emergency, that you would send in a social worker, that you would send in, someone that has had years of training, master's degrees, PhDs in dealing with mental health, should be sent to a mental health call. And in that, does that save us money? Well, we can also take a look at that, because as we, look into our budget, you look into, what are officers making in the city of San Jose, many with overtime because, we have lots of calls, about between $240,000 and $350,000 a year. About half of that is overtime for a lot of officers. I know my mom, social worker, doesn't even make $100,000, right? So we could say that's a savings if we send a social worker in. There's the other argument that social workers are extremely valuable members of our community and provide a very needed service for our community, and we should perhaps be paying them, what they might be worth in that scenario. But if we get to a spot where the correct people are responding to the correct type of calls, I think we're going to see a lot of this tendency to just sit down and say our police are underfunded and we need to hire more officers. That conversation might shift, because we might get to a point where we see that we do need more traffic officers. I hear that a lot from residents, that we never see a traffic cop, right? And is that because officers are spending their time on calls that, a school psychiatrist might need to respond to, or a nurse might need to respond to? I think there's lots of people that are in the healthcare profession, and say we deal with people that are, on drugs. We deal with people with mental illness. We deal with a lot of different type of people without the use of force, without the need to incapacitate them in a violent way. Like, should we consider that important for our community? So, there's a lot to unpack here. I'm planning on having a lot more discussions about it, because we're not going to get through it in 10, 20 minutes sitting on the stairs out here. But we're a community, and we have to have tough discussions like a community, which brings us back then to how, as a government, a local community voice, do we make sure that everyone in the community has a voice and gets their perspective shared and can find common ground and get to a good spot? There's a lot there. So if there aren't any other questions, I will call it for the day, and we can go from there. But again, send me your thoughts at JakeForD6 on social media, JakeForD6.com or .com is the website. JakeForD6@gmail.com is also a great way to reach out. Send me an email, send me your thoughts, so we can start to incorporate that into the community discussion. All right. Happy Hump Day, everybody.